Thank you, Madam Speaker. I also want to thank my colleagues from the Freedom Caucus for the hour that they spent sharing with the American people the facts and the statistics of what is happening at our southern border because of the inaction of Congress over quite a long time. As a historian, I love this building. I love the Capitol. I love spending time in this chamber and just think about the history of our nation and the historical moments that have taken place in here. And I love giving tours of the Capitol to constituents when they come and bring them into this chamber, and as they sit here, and I share with them that it's from this rostrum behind me that President Franklin Roosevelt gave his Day of Infamy speech. We walk down the hallway and we go to the rotunda, the magnificent rotunda that has portraits hanging in the rotunda that depict the history of America. And I share with them about how this is the greatest legislative body in the history of the world. We've become the envy of other nations as our deliberative bodies, that the strength of America and all that we have accomplished in this nation, the mind-boggling things that we've accomplished from aerospace to business and the ingenuity of America because of the strength of our freedom that has been built by a legislative body that brings the different sides together and negotiate to come up with solutions that are good for America. Our strength isn't because we've always agreed. No, we quite frankly disagree. And as our disagreements go back to the beginning of our nation. And in that rotunda is a portrait portraying a turning point in American history, a very critical part of American history. And it happened during the Second Continental Congress when our predecessors, those that came before us, the representative body that we now represent, were faced with a very critical decision. That decision was whether to vote in favor of declaring independence against Great Britain. There were strong advocates, very strong advocates in favor of independence. One of those was John Adams of Massachusetts. John Adams was strongly in favor of independence and spoke very passionately of voting in favor of independence. But just as strongly as John Adams was in favor of independence, you had John Dickinson from Pennsylvania, who also was as strongly opposed to independence. They continued to debate all aspects of whether they should declare independence. And in fact, there were others that disagreed, even to the point where the first vote for independence failed. But Dr. Benjamin Franklin understood the power of negotiating, the power of compromise, the power of bringing two sides together, and he began to negotiate. He began to bring the sides together. And by the time they took the second and final vote for independence, he had garnered enough votes to actually pass the motion to declare our independence from Great Britain. Now, the difference between John Adams and John Dickinson wasn't that they disagreed on the problem they were facing. No, they both agreed that there was atrocities committed on the American colonies by Great Britain. They only disagreed on how to deal with it. As I mentioned that, and as you know from history, the second vote barely passed. John Dickinson remained opposed to declaring independence. In fact, he voted no on the resolution when it was brought before the floor. However, as soon as the resolution passed, John Dickinson left Philadelphia and he joined the fight for independence. We're at an impasse here in this chamber, this historic chamber today, not because we have a differing opinion, but because we're even refusing to come together to lay out the facts, to lay out the ideas, to lay out the various solutions to this problem. We are the greatest, most powerful, and most influential legislative body in the world. We have been the envy of the entire world. Other nations have modeled or tried to model their legislative bodies after ours. But we should be embarrassed to where we are today, because this system is broken, and it isn't broken because of a design flaw. It's broken because of what we have turned this into. You see, we have broken the system because we have chosen to ignore our own rules, our own laws, and our own procedures. Most Americans may not realize it, but we have a deadline. We have a deadline every year of September 30th to fully fund the government. But the last time that was done was in the 1990s. We have continued to kick the can down the road. Every September, we get to the point that we just do a continuing resolution and we put it off to another date, until we get to a point that creates a crisis and we must fund the government, and then somebody holds the funding of the government hostage for whatever political partisan reason that they want. The 4 years I've been in Congress, I have worked diligently, as with others, to try to change this status quo system of ignoring our own laws and rules and procedures and consolidating the power of appropriations to just a few who get to call the shots and allow others to hold the American workers, the citizens and the businesses that rely on those workers who are furloughed. We hold them all hostage in our political partisan wrangling. I don't like where we are. I don't like the way the process is broken. We should not be here because we should have fully funded the entire government before the end of September. Now, to give credit where credit is due, over the last couple of years, the Republicans have made great efforts, House Republicans have made great efforts to try to accomplish that. In 2016 or 2017, we were actually able to pass all 12 of our appropriations bills out of this chamber before the deadline. It didn't happen in the Senate, but we were able to do it here. This year, we made an even greater accomplishment. We passed several of them. We passed 5 out of here that also went to the Senate, and the Senate passed them, went to the president's desk, and he signed them. But it's those remaining bills, the appropriation bills, that have us where we are today because we did not follow our own rules. I don't like it. Most of the members I know on our side don't like it. My dad, a World War II veteran, used to give me a piece of advice. He said, "Son, if there's something in life you don't like, you have 2 choices. You can do something to change the situation, or just accept the status quo and go on with your life. But complaining never accomplishes anything." We're at an impasse where 2 sides have dug in on what they both claim are ideological principles. Let's look at where we are. On one side, the Republican side believes that the drug trafficking, the weapon trafficking, human trafficking, sex trafficking, terrorist travel coming across the border is a national security and humanitarian crisis. In fact, the Vice President, when he met with us last week, used those words, that this is a national security and a humanitarian crisis we have at the border. The President of the United States also agrees that we have a crisis at the border. However, the other side that is also dug in, the Democrats, don't believe that we have a crisis. In fact, the talking points of the day have been, as you heard earlier, that the crisis has been manufactured, that the desire to build a border wall or a physical barrier is a vanity project for the president. Or as one reporter stated as he was at the border, he said, "Things are tranquil here." So we have one side claiming a crisis, the other side claiming conspiracy. I believe we do have a crisis at the border. I believe that that crisis is real, and that crisis has been going on for quite some time. As you can see on the board next to me here, I'm not the only one who believes that not only do we have a crisis, but we've had a crisis that has existed for quite some time. The President of the United States in 2014 stated, "We now have an actual humanitarian crisis on the border." In fact, what he said was, "We now have an actual humanitarian crisis on the border that only underscores the need to drop the politics and fix our immigration system once and for all." Now, some of you who are watching on television right now will look at that and immediately attribute that to our current president, President Trump. But if you think back, the President of the United States in 2014 was President Barack Obama. He is the one who said, yes, we do have a crisis. It's a humanitarian crisis at the border. But today, the Democrats, my colleagues on the other side, say the crisis doesn't exist. It's manufactured. It's a conspiracy. It really doesn't exist. Things are tranquil. Well, then you have to ask the question, what changed? We must have done something significant during that time period, but nothing has changed. We still have the status quo when it comes to our border and border security. In fact, President Obama went on to say, "In recent weeks, we have seen a surge of unaccompanied children arrive at the border, brought here and to other countries by smugglers and traffickers. The journey is unbelievably dangerous for these kids. The children who are fortunate enough to survive it will be taken care of while they go through the legal process. But in most cases, that process will lead them to be sent back home." This is exactly what our current president is saying. We have a humanitarian crisis as well as a national security crisis. In fact, for the 4 years I have served in Congress, I have been saying that our crisis at the border should not be categorized just as an immigration crisis, but it is a national security crisis. When I served on the Homeland Security Committee, we had many briefings by then the Obama administration, Department of Homeland Security, who went through all of what was going on at the border, the crossings at the border, the drugs, the weapons, who they were intercepting. And I identified at that time that we had a crisis at the border. But this issue at the border goes beyond even the time I've been in Congress. It's been going on for decades. It is a decades-old problem that, because of status quo, because of the broken system that we're working under, because politicians are comfortable with the status quo, we have not done anything to address it. In 2006, I was serving in the state legislature in Georgia. I was a young businessman who didn't like the way things were going in the state, so I took the advice of my father: if there's something in life you don't like, you do something to change the situation. So I ran for the state house and was elected. We were dealing with issues in Georgia of immigration. In fact, a young man by the name of Dustin Inman had lost his life because of an illegal immigrant driving drunk, hit the car, killing Dustin Inman and permanently making his mom disabled. It appeared to us that the federal government, the Congress in Washington, D.C., wasn't doing anything to fix the situation. So a group of legislators got together. We said, look, we may have to address some of this on our own, so we will go to the border. We're going to spend several days at the border to see what's going on ourselves. While I was at the border, I spent time with Border Patrol agents. We went up and down the border. They showed us where the physical barriers were working, but they also showed us where they had problems, and it was usually where the physical barrier ended. They shared with us the lack of funding that they had, the lack of adequate Border Patrol agents. They told us of the dangers that they were facing, but they also told us of their frustrations of catch and release. We also spent the night with a rancher after we had met with several residents who lived along the border and were telling us the horrific stories of crime that was going on their property and in their neighborhoods because of the cartel activity going on in the border. While we sat at this rancher's home that evening, who had, because of the lack of the adequate number of Border Patrol agents, he had to set up his own security systems and surveillance systems just to protect his property and protect his employees on his ranch. And we sat in in his home that evening watching on infrared night vision cameras. As you could see, coyotes, those that were helping to bring illegals across into the United States, as they would congregate inside of Mexico and they would move up to where there was a physical barrier, a border wall. I asked him at this point, I said, okay, what's going to happen? Are they going to scale the barrier? He said, no, they're just staging. All they're going to do is move a few miles down that wall to where the wall doesn't exist, and they will walk right across into the United States. And that's exactly what happened. We watched as they came into the United States, they ran to a gully, they hid in a gully until somebody came and picked them up. By the time the Border Patrol was able to get there, they were long gone. I kept the journal. And the other day I went back and I pulled that journal out from 2006 and I was reading over my experiences. And I got to the last entry of that journal that I wrote when I got home. And that journal said, I believe the government in Washington, D.C. doesn't want to solve the problem at our southern border. Again, they're happy with the status quo. Americans have been asking Congress to do something, not just about illegal immigration, but about the drugs coming across our nation. As you heard earlier, Homeland Security, the Department of Homeland Security has intercepted enough fentanyl used in opioids to kill nearly 2/3 of the entire population of the United States. They want us to do something about the sex trafficking, other drugs coming across the border, weapons, criminal activity, human trafficking, and terrorism, the terrorists that are traveling across the border. But we can't solve any of these issues nor reopen this government until we are willing and ready to come together and have a national debate. A debate about the merits of each side. Each side needs to come forward and present what are their priorities, what are their ideas for the solutions. Republicans have done that. We've laid out several different ideas, several different solutions. We have yet to hear anything from our colleagues on the other side, except for the word no. We must lay out our priorities. We must lay out our ideas, not just hurl insults at each side. Then we must debate, and the debate must be based on truth, on facts, not perceptions, not accusations. And it has to be based on what is best for the American people, not what is best for the politicians or a political victory or preparing for the next election. If we're going to get to this place, there has to be some things to take place. First of all, we have to have meetings, we have to have discussion, and we have to have negotiation. Just as Dr. Benjamin Franklin did at the onset of this nation, he brought the parties together in meetings, they began discussing, and then they started negotiating. That's how they came up with compromise. You have to have all three. You can't have one without the other. You can't have a discussion without first having a meeting. 2 weeks ago, congressional leaders were invited to the White House to first of all have a meeting to discuss where do we go from here to end this shutdown, to do something about border security, to move forward. But the answer given to the president when he asked, are you willing to negotiate border security, which includes building a physical barrier, the answer was no. End of story, end of discussion. Meetings aren't effective unless you actually are able to have a discussion and both sides are willing to negotiate. You also have to be able to deal with facts. Both sides have to be able to deal with facts. Again, the president invited leadership of the House to the White House, to the Situation Room, to discuss the facts, the issues that you've heard several of here tonight. However, as the Secretary of Homeland Security began to go through the issues, one by one, she was interrupted by the Speaker of the House, Ms. Pelosi, and was told that she wasn't interested in hearing the facts. In fact, according to a news media report, it was, I reject your facts. Secretary Nielsen said, well, madam, these aren't my facts, they are the facts. So we have to be able to deal with the truth, the facts. And one question that I'm always asked back home is Your colleagues on the other side of the aisle continue to say they are for border security. They are for national security. They just don't want a wall. Well, that's a question I have. So when the Democrats rejected the facts that came from the Department of Homeland Security about the atrocities that are going on, the criminal activities going on at the border, the president took it upon himself and he sent it to members of Congress. And immediately upon receiving this data, my colleagues and my friends on the other side started dismissing the data. When it came out that in 2017, the Department of Homeland Security intercepted 3,755 terrorists, that number was immediately challenged. And the other side was quick to point out, well, not all of those were caught at the border. And they were right. Not all were caught at the southern border. In fact, they properly pointed out that many of them were caught at our ports of entry at airports. So we should focus in that area, not on a border wall, even though a number were caught at the border. Well, that's fine. They say they're for border security. However, I question that because when President Trump, in his first year in office, identified this very problem that we had terrorists coming in from nations that are known to harbor, train, and fund terrorists, and he tried to put a travel ban on people coming in from those countries, the Democrats objected to it and actually took it to court and tried to stop him from actually implementing that. So it leads to the question, do they really want border security? When the statistic came out that 6,000 illegals associated with gangs have been apprehended by ICE, again, my colleagues challenged that statistics and brought up, well, only 800 gang members were actually apprehended at the southern border. Only 800. You know, just the other day, the district attorney of one of the largest counties in Georgia said that the greatest threat to Georgians today is gangs. And as we started looking at how do these gang members come in, our colleagues on the other side adequately pointed out, well, most of these gang members were not coming across the border, but they were here as a result of visa overstays. But we really do want border security, so we should address that. Well, last year, House Resolution 4760 in June was brought to this floor, which actually made visa overstays a federal misdemeanor. But my colleagues on the other side, every one of them voted against that bill. The Department of Homeland Security also put out the statistic that 17,000 adults were detained at the southern border with criminal records. The other side has made the argument that these are just families that want a better life. Again, they have rejected the facts. So my question is, do they really want border security? Are they really willing to come to the table and lay out what their priorities for border security really is? Is it port security at our airports? Well, obviously they opposed the president when he took that route. Is it addressing visa overstays? Well, obviously they voted against that bill when we brought it forward. Do they really want to keep the government open and address border security? Well, they all voted against the continuing resolution the Republicans brought to the floor back in December and opted to close the government. Do I believe that my colleagues want terrorists to come into the nation? No, I do not. Do I believe that they want more gang members to infiltrate our communities? No, I don't believe that's what they want. I don't believe they don't think that there's a crisis at the border. I just think that they're happy with the status quo. You see, this city often runs on people that have learned how to navigate the swamp. They learn how to use the status quo to their advantage. And if you go back and you look over the history of this nation, especially the modern history of this body of Congress, we are still debating several of the issues that we were debating 10, 15, and 20 years ago. It seems that these become campaign issues more than they are issues that we want to resolve for the American people. Why? Because we don't want to address the status quo. What we have in the White House right now is a president whose main objective is to change the status quo in Washington, to change the way we do things. And those ideas I support because what we're doing now is broken. The way we're doing it now is broken. There is only one way out of this situation. It's for my colleagues from the other aisle to actually agree to attend the meetings. In fact, the White House, the President opened up the White House today for another meeting to start discussing and hopefully get to negotiations. But the leadership on the Democrat side refused to even show up. We have offered several compromises last year in December to avoid the shutdown, but the resounding response we received from the other side was no. Every attempt that we've brought to this floor to try to resolve the situation at the border has been met with a resounding no. At some point, we have to get away from our own partisan political wrangling and understand that what we are doing is for the safety and the security of the American people. It's time to quit just saying no and say, but if. I appreciate every person that was elected to represent the American people. But now is the time to sit down, to have a discussion, and begin to negotiate so we can reopen the government, but more importantly, ensure the safety and the security of all Americans. God bless you. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I yield back.